I have delivered 411 demonstrations of inevitability in my career. I know the number because the ascendancy keeps the number, and the number is a kind of rank. A junior envoy who has delivered 40 is treated one way. An envoy who has delivered 400 is treated another. By the time of the events I am going to describe, I was the most senior living practitioner of my profession, and I had reached the comfortable stage of a career in which I no longer expected to be surprised by anything. I want to be honest about that, because everything that follows is the story of how wrong a person can be while remaining, technically, very good at their job. The summons reached me during the recitation of settled outcomes, which is a ceremony the ascendancy performs every cycle to remind itself of the things it has already decided. I was standing in the great hall on the homeworld, listening to the names of absorbed civilizations being read in their proper order, when an attaché approached and pressed a data fold into my hand with the particular stiffness of someone delivering news above their clearance. I read it. Then I had my translation matrix read it again, because one of the words in the human transmission attached to the summons had come back marked. The matrix renders everything. It is the finest interpretive instrument in the reach. But against this one human word it returned a flat notation I had not seen in years. No equivalent in ascendancy speech. The word was please. I noted it, the way one notes a small mechanical fault, and thought no more about it. I was wrong to think no more about it, but I did not know yet that I would be keeping a list. Here is what the summons said, stripped of its formality. The ascendancy had completed its assessment of the human border systems and had reached a settled outcome. The systems would be absorbed. The humans were a young species, 19 years into contact, holding a thin scatter of worlds along a corridor the ascendancy wished to consolidate. They had no significant fleet that our surveys could find. They had no allies of consequence. They were, in the language of my profession, a clean acquisition. My task was to travel to their border, deliver the demonstration of inevitability, and return with their formal acknowledgement. The ascendancy does not threaten. I want this understood because it is the center of who we are or who we were. A threat implies that the outcome is in doubt, that force might be required, that the other party retains a choice. We do not deal in threats. We inform. We arrive, we lay out the shape of what is going to happen. We demonstrate the scale of what stands behind it, and the other party, being rational, accepts the inevitable. In 411 demonstrations, I had never once had to be anything other than calm. Calm is the privilege of the certain. There was one irregularity in the assignment, and I noted it the way I noted the word. The humans had requested that I come in person. More than that, they had requested, through their thin diplomatic channel, that before I delivered anything formal, I allow them to show me something. The attaché found this insulting. A demonstration of inevitability is not a negotiation. One does not pause it to look at exhibits. I found it, at the time, merely quaint. A young species, frightened, wanting to make its case, to show me its little accomplishments before the door closed. I decided I would permit it. Generosity costs nothing when the outcome is settled. I departed 11 days later with the absorption schedule fully prepared, every phase timed, every contingency mapped. I had delivered this speech in some form 400 times. I rehearsed it anyway out of professional respect for the work, on the long passage out to the human border. I knew the 3 responses I would receive, because in 400 deliveries there had only ever been 3. There was fear, which presented as silence and rapid acquiescence. There was bargaining, which presented as a frantic listing of things the species imagined it could offer. And there was defiance, which was the most theatrical and the least consequential, and which always ended the same way as the other 2. I prepared for all 3. I was prepared for nothing. The human station was called Meridian, and it sat at the dark edge of a border system where 2 corridors crossed and neither was worth much. It was not impressive. It was a working structure, patched and repatched, lit unevenly, the kind of place built by people who did not have the resources to build it twice and so had built it to last. As my craft was brought in, I watched the station through the viewport and began, against my own expectations, to take notes. Not because I was instructed to. Because something about the humans had already begun to itch at the edge of my training. I had studied them on the passage, of course. I had read everything the Ascendancy held, which was not much, because we had not considered them worth a thick file. But I had read it twice, and twice it had failed to resolve into a shape I recognized. The humans argued. This was the first thing. They argued with each other constantly, openly, including with their own commanders, in ways that in any Ascendancy structure would have been a collapse of order, and yet the arguing did not produce collapse. It produced, somehow, decisions, which they then executed with a coherence their arguing should have made impossible. I could not model it. My matrix could not model it. When I asked the matrix to render the human term for the relationship between a commander and the subordinates who openly disputed his orders, it returned the notation again. No equivalent in Ascendancy speech. The word had been trust. I added it to the list beneath please, and told myself I was simply being thorough. The being who met me at the airlock was named Priya Nair, and her title translated as liaison, which in Ascendancy practice is a low function performed by clerks. She did not behave like a clerk. She greeted me with a calm that I recognized, because it was the calm I myself used, the calm of a person who is not performing for the individual in front of them. This unsettled me more than any display of fear would have. Fear I could have catalogued. I had 400 entries for fear. "Ambassador Caldris," she said, "thank you for coming in person. We know it wasn't required." "It was a courtesy," I said. "The outcome of this visit is already settled. I have come to inform you of its shape, and then to permit you the demonstration you requested as a kindness." She did not flinch at settled, which the bargainers always did, nor stiffen at kindness, which the defiant ones always did. She tilted her head slightly, an expression I would later learn the humans used for mild interest, and said, "We appreciate the kindness. We'd like to extend one back. Before you inform us of anything, will you let us show you the thing first? It changes how the conversation goes. We've found that out the hard way." I should have read those last words more carefully. The hard way. It implied a history. It implied that humans had stood in something like this position before and learned something from it. But I was 411 demonstrations into a flawless career, and I did not yet understand that I was the one being studied. "Where is your strength?" I asked her as we walked the corridors of Meridian. I asked it directly because directness is a tool, and a frightened species will often reveal its calculations when asked plainly. "I have your surveys. You have perhaps 40 vessels of consequence across these systems. You have no allies who would spend a fleet on you. Where, liaison, do your people feel safe?" She considered the question longer than I expected. Then she said, "Nowhere. We don't feel safe anywhere. That's sort of the whole point of us." I noted that too, though I did not yet know under what heading to file it. The admiral was named Tom Halloran, and he was old in the way that humans get old, which is to say worn rather than diminished. He received me in a plain room with a plain table, no ceremony, no display of rank, which I read at the time as either weakness or a clumsy attempt to seem unintimidating. I delivered the demonstration. I delivered it well. I laid out the absorption schedule, the timing of each phase, the consolidation of the corridors, the precise and inevitable shape of what was going to happen to his people. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I let the scale of the ascendancy stand behind the words, 4,000 years of settled outcomes, and I waited for one of the three responses. Halloran listened to all of it without interrupting, which already placed him outside my catalog, because the frightened interrupt and the defiant interrupt, and only a certain kind of person listens to the entire shape of their own ending without saying a word. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a good speech. You've given it before." "Many times," I said. "I can tell it's smooth." He folded his hands on the table. "Before you file the acknowledgement, Ambassador, I'd like you to come with me and look at something. It's not far, a few days, and I'll be honest with you about why. It's not to change your mind with an argument. We've found arguments don't work on people who think the outcome is settled. It's because I think you should know what you'd actually be choosing before you choose it. After that, you do whatever you came to do. I won't stop you. In 411 demonstrations, no one had ever said I won't stop you. The defiant said you cannot make us. The frightened said what do you want from us? But I won't stop you. That was the language of a person who did not believe stopping me was the relevant question. My matrix flagged nothing in the sentence. Every word translated cleanly. And yet I could not read it against anything I knew, and the inability to read it produced in me, for the first time in a very long career, a sensation I eventually identified as unease. I agreed to go. I told myself it was generosity. It was not. It was that I needed to know what he meant, and I have never in my life been able to leave a thing I do not understand alone. We traveled 3 days to a system that did not appear on the consolidation maps because there was nothing in it worth consolidating. A dead star, cooling, no worlds of value. The kind of system surveys note once and never revisit. As we approached, I asked Halloran what we had come to see, and he said only, "It's better if you see it without me describing it first. Descriptions make it smaller than it is." We dropped out of transit into the dark of that dead system, and at first I saw nothing, and I began to suspect a crude theatrical maneuver. Then the human vessel's instruments began to paint the space around us, and the dark resolved, and I understood that we were not alone in that system. We were surrounded. I have tried many times since to describe what I saw, and I have never found the words, in my language or theirs, that hold it. The Ascendancy fleet is the largest concentrated force in the Reach. I had stood at the heart of it. What waited in that dead system was not larger than the Ascendancy fleet in the way a bigger thing is larger than a smaller thing. It was larger in the way the dark is larger than a room. It went out, and the instruments kept finding more of it, hull after hull after hull, silent, unlit, cold, holding station in the black with no power signatures because they did not need to run, they only needed to wait. I asked the human navigator how many. She told me. I had the Matrix confirm the figure because I did not believe her. The Matrix confirmed it. I will not write the number here. I have decided the number is not mine to spread. It is enough to say that it was not a fleet meant to win a battle. It was too large for that. It was a fleet meant to end something. "This is your strength," I said to Halloran. My voice, I am told, had changed. "This is what you hid from the surveys." "It's not hidden to hurt you," Halloran said. "It's just quiet. Quiet's a different thing." He stood beside me at the viewport and looked at the dark and the shapes in it, and there was no pride in his face, which is what I had expected, the way a species displays its great work and waits for the awe. There was none. There was something heavier. "Ambassador, I'm going to tell you what this is, and I need you to listen to the whole thing the way you wanted me to listen to your whole speech. Can you do that?" I said that I could. "This fleet can't win a war," he said. "I want you to understand that first because it's the part everyone gets wrong. It is not built to defeat you. If your ascendancy came at us with everything, this fleet would not save our worlds. We'd still lose them. We've run it 10,000 times. We lose." He let that sit. "What this fleet is built to do is make sure that if we lose, if it ever becomes certain that we're going to be ended, then whoever is ending us ends too. All of them. Their worlds, their fleet, their ascendancy, their 4,000 years of settled outcomes. Everything. It is not a weapon for winning. It's a guarantee that nobody wins. We call it a deterrent. Your matrix is going to have trouble with the next part." He was right. The next thing he said, the matrix marked. The word was enough. As in, we built exactly enough to make the cost of our ending equal to everything. No equivalent in ascendancy speech. Because the ascendancy does not have the concept of enough. We have only the concept of more, applied until the outcome is settled. I added it to the list, and my hand, I noticed, was not entirely steady. I asked him the question that I had not planned to ask, that was not in any procedure, that came out of me before I could shape it into something professional. "Why," I said, "would a species build a thing it prays never to use? What kind of people do this?" And here Halloran did the thing I have thought about every day since. He did not give me a clean answer. He looked at the dark fleet for a long moment and then he said, "You're asking me to tell you we're good people. I'm not going to tell you that. I don't know if we are. I know what we are." He turned from the viewport and looked at me directly in that unbearable human way. "We almost did it to ourselves, Ambassador. A long time ago, when we were one world, we built weapons that could end us, and for most of a century we held our own extinction in our hands and argued about it. We came close, closer than your records say any species should survive and stay sane. And we learned a thing about ourselves in that century that I don't think your people have ever had to learn, because you've always been the biggest thing in the room." "What did you learn?" I asked. My voice was very quiet. "That we cannot be trusted with certainty," he said. "That nobody can. That the moment one side knows for sure it can win, it stops asking whether it should. We didn't build this fleet because we trust you. We built it because we don't trust anyone, including ourselves, and the only thing we found that works, the only thing in our entire bloody history that ever reliably worked, is making sure nobody can ever be certain they'll win. So we took the worst thing we ever learned about ourselves, and we pointed it at anyone who'd make us choose. That's not goodness, Ambassador. I won't insult you by calling it goodness. It's just the most expensive lesson any species ever paid for, and we're the ones still carrying the receipt." I understood, standing in that dead system in front of that silent fleet, that my demonstration of inevitability was finished before I delivered it. Not because the humans had threatened me. They had not. Halloran had been scrupulously, almost gently honest. He had shown me the cost and then stepped back and said, as he had said before, "You do whatever you came to do, I won't stop you." And I finally understood what that sentence meant, the sentence my matrix could translate and I could not read. It meant, the choice is real and it is yours, and we have made sure that it is a true choice and not a settled one. That was the moment the trap closed, and the trap was not theirs. It was ours. The ascendancy is built on a single principle, and the principle is that outcomes are inevitable. Everything we are rests on it. Our ceremonies recite settled outcomes. Our diplomacy informs rather than threatens because we have never once, in 4,000 years, faced a situation in which the outcome was genuinely in doubt. Our entire civilization is the accumulated confidence of a species that has always been the biggest thing in the room. And now I stood before a fact that the principle could not absorb. For the first time in 4,000 years, there was an inevitable outcome, and the outcome was that everyone died. If we proceeded, we would win the human worlds and lose everything. If we acknowledged that and stopped, we would be admitting for the first time that an outcome had stopped us. Either path unmade the principle. The humans had not defeated our fleet. They had defeated our certainty, which was the only thing we had never learned to live without. I did not file the acknowledgement. There was nothing left to acknowledge. I returned to the homeworld with the absorption schedule still sealed, and a list of human words in my matrix that had no equivalent in our speech, and I requested an audience with the ruling council, which is a thing an envoy may do once in a career, and which I had never used. The council chamber of the ascendancy is the oldest room in the Reach, and it is built to make the individual standing in it feel the weight of 4,000 settled outcomes. I had stood at its edge many times. I had never stood at its center. They let me because procedure required it and because none of them yet understood what I had come to say. I had prepared a report. It was thorough. It laid out the fleet, the figures, the strategic assessment, the recommendation. I had spent the entire passage home writing it. I did not use it. I stood at the center of the oldest room in the Reach, and I looked at the council that had decided 411 outcomes I had personally delivered, and I said, "I have one question, and the question is my report." The first of the council, an elder I had known my entire career, said that I had been granted the floor to deliver an assessment, not to ask questions. "The question is the assessment," I said. "Our doctrine holds that we do not threaten because outcomes are inevitable and the inevitable does not require a threat. I have spent my life delivering that doctrine, So I will ask the council to do what the doctrine has always done. Tell me the inevitable outcome of the human absorption. State it aloud as we state all settled outcomes. I will wait. There was a silence in the chamber that I had never heard there before. The council chamber has a particular quality of silence, the silence of a room that is always certain. This was a different silence. It was the silence of a room discovering that it was not. The first said slowly that the assessment of the human campaign had concluded that the human worlds could be taken. That is not the outcome, I said. That is the first half of the outcome. State the rest. State what the human fleet does at the moment our victory becomes certain. State it the way we state all settled things. And because I had brought the figures, and because the council had access to the same figures, and because we are, whatever else we are, a rational people, the first stated it. The first stated that at the moment of certain human defeat, the human deterrent would render the ascendancy, its worlds, its fleet, and its accumulated outcomes. The word the first used was void, reduced to nothing. The inevitable outcome of our certain victory was our certain end. The number went through the chamber the way I imagined the number went through that other chamber, on that other world, when a human commander asked a council to say aloud how many of the small species would survive their orderly process. I had not heard that story yet. I would hear it later, and I would understand that I had, without knowing it, done the human thing. I had not won an argument. I had made a room say the truth out loud, and the truth, once said, does not leave the room. It stays. It changes the temperature of things. It makes certain sentences impossible to speak afterward. The ascendancy did not announce a withdrawal, because the ascendancy does not withdraw. Because withdrawal would admit that an outcome had stopped us. What the ascendancy did was subtler and entirely characteristic. It declared the human absorption, deferred pending strategic reassessment, which is the language we use for things we have decided never to do again, while pretending the decision is temporary. The consolidation of the corridors proceeded around the human systems, leaving them as a small, uncatalogued gap in an otherwise settled map. The gap is still there. I have seen newer envoys look at it on the consolidation charts and frown, and I have watched their senior officers decline to explain it, and I have said nothing, because some things are better learned the way I learned them. It has been some years now. The border holds. There has been no war which is unremarkable, and there has been something else which is not. The doctrine of inevitability, which held without challenge for 4,000 years, has developed across the reach, a very small and very quiet crack. Other species have noticed the gap in our map. They have noticed that the ascendancy, which informs but does not threaten, encountered something it could not inform and stopped. A few of them have begun to wonder what else might be uncertain. I do not think the ascendancy will fall. We are too old and too large for that. But we are, for the first time in our history, a civilization that knows it does not know every outcome, and a civilization that knows that is a different civilization than one that does not. I returned on the cycle after the council to the Great Hall for the recitation of settled outcomes. I stood and listened to the names of absorbed civilizations being read in their proper order, as I had stood and listened the day the summons reached me. The recitation was exactly as it had always been. I was not. I stood there and I thought about a dead system and a silent fleet, and a worn old human who had refused to tell me his people were good. And I found that the ceremony, which had comforted me my entire life, now sounded to me like a list of times we had been the biggest thing in the room, and had not yet met the room that would teach us we were not. I keep the list still, the human words with no equivalent in our speech: please, trust, enough, mercy, never again. For most of my career the list was a record of human imprecision, of a young species that had not yet learned to think clearly. I understand it differently now. The list is not a record of what humans lack the precision to say. It is a record of what the ascendancy lacks the experience to mean. We never built the words because we never paid the price that makes the words necessary. We were never close enough to our own ending to need a word for never again. There is one final thing, and it is the thing I think about most, and it is the reason I have written all of this down. Last cycle, the ascendancy's linguistic authority, which adapts our speech with extreme reluctance and only when forced, issued a quiet revision to the formal lexicon. It added one word. The word is constructed from our own roots, but it is a translation, and the concept it translates is human, and it had no equivalent in our speech until now. The closest rendering in their language is deterrence. But the Council's definition is longer than that, and I have read it many times, and I will give it here as it is written, because I helped write it. The discipline of a power that has already paid the price of its own misuse, and therefore declines to be certain. The ascendancy does not threaten. We inform. For 4,000 years, that was the language of the biggest thing in the room. Now there is a word in our lexicon that we learned from a species 19 years into contact, holding 40 ships and a dead system full of silence, and the worst lesson any people ever survived. We learned it the hard way, which Liaison Nair told me on the first day was the only way her people had ever learned anything worth keeping. I have delivered no demonstrations of inevitability since. I have asked instead to be assigned to the human border, where I now spend my days learning a language that keeps surprising me with words I did not know a civilization could need. I am not certain it is the right posting. I have decided that not being certain is, perhaps, the most useful thing I have ever learned to be. There is a school now on one of the human border worlds. I am told the children there are taught, among other things, the history of the century when their species held its own extinction in its hands and chose, in the end, to put it down. I have requested permission to visit. I would like to hear how they tell it. I suspect they do not tell it as a victory. I suspect they tell it as a Tuesday, which is a human word for an ordinary day, and which my matrix renders cleanly, and which I have come to understand may be the most important word they have.